Hi everyone, I'm Dave Gaskin. Welcome to this artist commentary version of the Colouring Penguin time-lapse video. If you've not watched it already, pause this one, go back and watch the time-lapse, and then come back here and we'll talk about the process involved. So I was really excited to work on this card. Batman Returns is one of my favourite 90s films. It's actually one of my favourite Christmas films. And I remember when the film came out in 1992, I was 15. And yeah, just at the point where I was getting into movies in a big way. The original Batman from 1989 had been a constant rewatch at home, recorded it off the telly, watched it many, many times. So I was very excited to hear that there was going to be a sequel, that Tim Burton would be coming back, that Michael Keaton would return as the Dark Knight. And then even more so when it was announced that Danny DeVito would be playing the Penguin. Danny DeVito, for those 80s kids out there, be a familiar face from Romancing the Stone, Jewel of the Nile, Twins, Throw Mama from the Train. His back catalogue is fantastic. And so his portrayal of Oswald Cobblepot, aka the Penguin, in this film was a real highlight. I mean, you know, the makeup by Stan Winston and just his performance was superb. So I often get excited when I get to draw from some of my favourite films. And so this one, yeah, I mean, the Penguin's skin tone is obviously not natural. He's quite pale, like a greyish purple. And so when I was initially working out which colours I was going to use, I decided to try and avoid going in with greys, because obviously that will, you won't get such a nice vivid colour if you do the grey. I've talked about this in previous videos, the Terminator 2 cards in particular, where I used to use a grey foundation layer and then add colour over the top. The grey would mean that the colours weren't quite so bold and vibrant. And as I've learned over the years working with Copics, if you go straight in with colour, for me anyway, the end result tends to be something that I'm trying to get to. Nice bold colours. So you can see here I went in fairly early with very pale pinks and purples. On a previous video I've been asked to include the Copic numbers, so you knew exactly which Copics I was using, and I've been trying to figure out a way to include that in the video, which isn't as straightforward as I thought it might be. So as we go through, I'll try and remember which pens I was using specifically. I think the initial layers around the eyes and around his jaw, those were the E70s, so E70, E71. I usually use those actually when I'm working with more natural skin tones as well. You know, the natural skin tones are sort of E00, E01, that sort of range. And then the E70s will come in a little bit later to add a little bit of shadow. So just sticking with light pinks and purples. His skin, there's not a lot of contrast on his skin tone in this particular photo that I was working from, so I decided I would try and exaggerate some of the colours to make it more visually pleasing. So we're still sticking with pinks and purples for now, but a little bit later on I introduce a little bit of blue and green. It's one of those moments, and as you know I like capturing moments, and this is a moment where Penguin is standing in his mayoral candidate headquarters, surrounded by his staff, and I think he's on a spiral staircase, and he's just bitten someone's nose. I mean, you know, it's a funny moment in the movie, and so I knew there was going to be some bold red coming in. I know for a fact that I used R27 for that. It's my favourite red Copic. I've used it a lot over the last few years. It gets used regularly on Darth Maul. When I was working on the Last Jedi trading card sets for Topps, I used R27 for the troopers and the guards in Snoke's room that Rey and Adam Driver's character, Kylo. Why am I forgetting these small details? That Rey and Kylo battle with in the throne room sequence. So yeah, R27 will be coming in soon. And so here we're adding in some subtle blues. I think I'm using a little bit of warm grey because the skin tone isn't the sort of the peachy orangey colour that you might expect. The warm grey without adding this too much of a grey overtone to it works quite nicely. And the area around his eyes is quite dark in this reference, so I tried to get the contrast going in there fairly quickly as well. And yeah, so here you go, here's the R27 that I just mentioned. I knew this was going to pop, and so when you've got a real bold, vibrant colour on top of a fairly light area, I try to put that bold, vibrant colour in towards the end, quite late, because if you put it in too soon and you're then trying to shade around it, there's a risk that you're going to blend it and it'll go into areas that you don't want it to. So, and the same with the hair. I didn't start working on the hair too early because that's a lot darker than the edges of the face, and so I didn't want to put in dark browns and greys around the pale face and then risk that blending over into the skin area. So I'm starting to put the hair tones in here, but I mean, Batman Returns, I mean, I think everybody's seen it. I hope everybody's seen it. Back in '92, it was the big film. I think on its opening weekend, in fact, it set a new record for most successful opening weekend. I think it was close to $50 million, and that record stood until the following year when Jurassic Park arrived. And I mean, then all records were smashed, weren't they? But Batman Returns was superb. I remember I was doing work experience in an architect's department in my home city of Birmingham, and one of the guys who was there worked in a local comic store called Nostalgia and Comics, which was one of my favourite stores in Birmingham. I've mentioned it before. In the early 80s, that's where all the Star Wars figures came from, and comics, obviously. And yeah, he worked at Nostalgia and Comics as well as working in the architects department, and we hit it off quite quickly. We shared a love for movies, and we both got talking about Batman Returns because it was due to be released fairly soon, and so he managed to get me. Thinking back, I don't know how he got it for me, but the making of Batman Returns book with all those really nice behind-the-scenes photos, which back then was all we really had to go on. You know, there was no internet, there was no IMDb, there was no behind-the-scenes featurettes on DVDs. They didn't exist yet. So the making of books were kind of a staple, and the things that I really looked forward to flicking through when I found a film that I really loved and wanted to know more about. So he got me a copy of the making of Batman Returns, which I still have in my little making of books collection. So yeah, it was a really exciting time, and I can't remember if I got the book before seeing the film, but anyway, it was great fun. And Nostalgia and Comics actually had huge, I think they must have gotten them from a cinema somehow, but the big banners, and they had them up really high above all the shelves. They were, I don't know, 25, 30 foot wide. And then when I went back to visit the shop a couple of decades later, they were still there. So we're talking early 2000s. They'd still got these Batman Returns posters up, so I think that says something about the long-lasting effect of that film. So yeah, so now I've added some blues and greens. You can kind of see it around the side of his face there, and adding some loose sort of rough shading to his clothing. With these cards, I tend to try and focus more on the face, and so although I want the clothing to look quite realistic, the face is my focus, and because I'm working in a more realistic style, which is just my natural preference, that's how I've always worked. I try not to spend too long working on the clothes because I don't want to overwork it, and I want the face to be the thing that jumps out at you. Fortunately, with Penguin's attire, it's mostly grey, a little bit blood spattered, so the R27 will come back in, and I think I also use some red colour pencil as well, just to finesse those details slightly. But with these cards, and specifically these 90s to the Extreme cards, the cardstock takes markers really well, so I try not to add too much colour pencil afterwards, because the first couple of layers of pencil will be a little bit patchy and almost grainy, and so when you're working with colour pencil as well, you have to know that you're going to spend more time working with the colour pencil to really make them smooth. And so yeah, on this one, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with the background. And so here now, you see me penciling in some detail. And again, it's because I wanted to capture that moment, and for those who know the movie, I wanted them to know exactly which bit we're talking about. And so I've just penciled in the lettering. There's quite a lot of text and sort of the billboards and signs, stuff going on in the back of his headquarters, Cobblepot for mayor, something like that, you know? And it has this kind of red to pink gradient going on. So Although it's a very small little section that's going on in the corner there, hopefully it's enough for those who know exactly which bit it is to go, oh yeah, I know what we're looking at here. And this is quite rare as well. Normally I ink a card and I will let it sit, sometimes for an entire day, just to ensure that the inks are completely dry. So that when I go in with the markers, I know that there's no risk of the inks being smudged. Whereas here, I've just inked the really black area in the background, but because the background is going to be a little bit blurry and a bit out of focus, I'm not as concerned if those inks get a little bit smudged. It'll just kind of add to the effect. So, although the focus of the card, the penguin himself, isn't quite finished, I'll quite often make sure I put the background in, and then I can just go in and rework any areas that aren't standing out quite so clearly, or there needs to be a little bit more foreground background contrast, that sort of thing. I do like my blurry backgrounds, and I've just recently started doing a few more Star Wars cards, personal ones, with a portrait focus, working in colour pencil, and I found it's interesting to see how my use of colour has evolved, because I never really worked with colour pencil, solely colour pencil before. But I'd never really worked solely with coloured markers before. You know, I started with grayscale, so I think working with the coloured markers has given me an understanding of how the colours work together. And so now that I'm working in colour pencil, it's allowing me to work with much softer edges. I'm not inking the outlines, which is kind of a look that I've been trying to head towards for some time. And so, although I'm still enjoying doing these markers and ink cards, I'm kind of flipping back and forth between just colour pencil and this style. So he's getting close to being done, although I realised while I was filming that I would probably do a little bit more work on it afterwards. Just because of the nature of my setup, my camera looks down over my shoulder, and quite often I like to get my nose really close down to the card. But if I do that, then my head would get into the video and it would ruin the entire thing. And I have actually headbutted the camera before as well, which obviously isn't ideal. So yeah, just finishing the clothes here. I've added you can see a few little dots with the R27, and here we go with this is just a red Polychromos pencil, nothing special. I just found I could get some slightly finer detail with that rather than the tip of the brush nib of the Copic, which wasn't going quite as fine as I would like. And I'm just standing the card up there because the light that I have on my desk is reflecting slightly from the card, so I'm just making sure that it looks good when it's not got that reflective light on it. So a little bit more work around the forehead. I mean, there's not a huge amount of work done in that area really. It's easy to overwork a card, so if you're going for a realistic style, which is what I tend to prefer, I study the reference quite carefully. And if you're trying to capture lightness and realism, it's an observational depth that you need to focus on. And it's those little details like a tiny speck of light on the side of the nose and the little tiny bit of white light on the blood that's coming down his chin. So yeah, there we go, white dots in the eyes. I mean, that's often a touch that I have to try and stop myself from doing too early, because I find as soon as you put those dots in, the eyes come to life, but at the same time I then don't want to do too much work around that. I don't want to spoil those little highlights. So just some finishing touches around the side of the face, and with creases on the side of this face as well, there's often a highlighted edge. So yeah, just to try and avoid it looking too flat really. So there we go, there's a slightly more close-up view of the card. But yeah, it still needs a little bit more work, but I'd say it's 97–98% done. So if you like this card, come and follow me on social media. You'll see the finished thing. Subscribe here on YouTube if you haven't already, and if you enjoyed this video. And yeah, thanks for watching, and hopefully see you on the next one. Cheers.